Hello and welcome back to my channel. On this video, I'm going to be talking about all of the books that I read in the month of May 2024, and it turned out to be 32 of them. So a ton of really great reading this month, and let's go ahead and get started with what I was able to get through. So the first book I picked up is called First Lie Wins by Ashley Elston. I think this is a new author to me, and this is basically a kind of like mystery thriller. And the basic premise is there's a woman who's kind of a con artist, and she gets assigned to different jobs by this boss, and the boss is anonymous. She doesn't know who this person is, but obviously she's getting paid for running these cons. And she's in the middle of one, and then this person shows up that has her original name, not like the fake name that she's using for the con, but like her original name. And she doesn't know what's going on. And so she's trying to kind of like figure out what is happening and why this person is showing up. And it feels very like ominous, like it's some kind of warning, or she's trying to kind of understand what to do. And that's like a big part of the plot of this book. I enjoyed this book. I thought it was creative in terms of the kinds of things that it was kind of playing with for a mystery thriller. And it was a great way to start out the month. All right, so next up in the month, I was able to make it through the entire Lost and Found series by Catherine Cowles. And I had read the first book in this series last month, and then I sped through the remaining 4 books. It's a 5-book series. And just very briefly, the second book in the series is called Echoes of You. The third book is called Glimmers of You. The fourth book is called Shadows of You. And the 5th book is called Ashes of You. And this whole series, I won't go into each of the individual books, but basically this is an interconnected romance suspense series where a couple of the main characters in this series that have kind of these like romantic entanglements are law enforcement officers. And so there's like these different crimes that are being brought up within the books in addition to kind of the romantic storylines. I love romance suspense. I was completely sucked in. I will absolutely be picking up more Catherine Cowles books. I thought these were super fun. And I just wanted to keep reading. Like I wanted to know what was going to happen with this family and with, you know, these different relationships that were happening. And I also thought the suspense was really interesting as well. I would say that the last book was probably my favorite in terms of the mystery that was brought kind of to the surface, with the first book in the series being kind of a close second. And I just thought these were really fun. So I'm looking forward to checking out more from that author. All right, then I also picked up the Infernal Devices trilogy by Cassandra Clare. So this was my box set challenge for the month of May. And I had previously read, I always forget the other series name of what she writes. Hang on, let me remind myself of the Mortal Instruments. So there's a 6-book series called The Mortal Instruments, and then there's a trilogy called The Infernal Devices. The Mortal Instruments takes place in present day. Infernal Devices takes place in the past, in like the late 1800s in London. And Mortal Instruments is in New York. So there's a couple different like time periods, different geographical locations. I have to say, when I read the Mortal Instruments, I enjoyed it, you know, but I wasn't like bowled over. You know, I just thought like, oh, I get why this is popular. You know, I enjoyed reading it. When I picked up the Infernal Devices, and the books are called Clockwork Angel, Clockwork Prince, and Clockwork Princess, I really liked this trilogy, like more so than I liked the Mortal Instruments. I appreciated that I had been introduced to what was going on in the Mortal Instruments 6-book series. Like it's the same kind of like magic system, and like the world building is pretty much the same. But there was something about it being kind of set in a historical location, and the characters that you're following in this trilogy, I just really got sucked in like immediately, more so than the Mortal Instruments. So I'm glad I did the reading order that I did, but I liked this set better than the Mortal Instruments set. And the characters that are in the Mortal Instruments have continuing books. The characters that are in the Infernal Devices also have continuing books. So I'm sure I will dive into those at some point, but I would say highly recommend this particular series. I loved reading it on audio. Okay, then I picked up Abby Jimenez's latest book, Just for the Summer. This is the 3rd book in her Part of Your World series, which is a romance series that she writes. And they're like loosely interconnected. They could probably be read as standalones and it wouldn't be a problem. But I have read them in order, and I feel like it's hard for me to pick a favorite. Like they're all very good. And this particular one is basically about two people who feel like they're kind of cursed because whenever they date someone, the next person, like after they break up with that person, the next person that person's dates is like the one. And so they're never the one who's chosen. They're always the one that's like right before the one who's chosen. And there's a man and a woman who have this same experience. And so they decide to basically date each other to try to break the curse. And this is a book that, as always, I mean, if you've watched other videos that I've made, you know that I love romantic comedies and romance novels that have like these really fun like side characters and like good friend groups and family, you know, relationships. And this is one that has some dysfunctional family stuff going on, but there's like a best friend who's really fun. And there's like these other relationships that get kind of brought into the storyline that I really enjoyed. So would highly recommend that one as well. All right, then I picked up Magnolia Parks. This is by Jessa Hastings. And this is a book that I talked about in my TBR video as being described as like toxic romance, but everybody like gets totally sucked into it. So I was like, okay, I'm just gonna like try this out and see what I think. And it is very toxic romance. It's basically about this like on again, off again couple where, and I don't want to give away any spoilers, but basically there's a couple that's together. They're in London, they're very wealthy, and they're just kind of like wandering around. Like, I'm not even sure they have jobs. Like, I mean, they're just kind of wandering around their social set basically. And something happens, which I will not go into because we find out about it throughout the book, but they break up and they remain best friends. Like, they see each other all the time. They sleep in each other's bedrooms. They're not having like a relationship, like a romantic relationship, but they're very close and they hang out a lot together. And it's kind of like this understood thing that like they're eventually going to get back together, you know, like they're just kind of like waiting for the right moment. But there's like some substance abuse and like other things that are happening in this book that are causing like some challenges within these relationships. I will admit I got pretty sucked into it. I mean, I can understand why people are like, I kind of love to hate it, you know, in terms of it's very well plotted. I mean, like you're continually engaged in it. I don't know how much further I'll go with this series. I mean, I'm kind of intrigued, but I feel like it's just kind of like candy. Like it's something that you would like watch like for reality television. Like, I mean, it's just pure, just like enjoyment. And so if that sounds interesting to you, I would recommend that you pick it up. Okay, then I picked up a book called Flock by Kate Stewart. This is the first book in the Ravenhood series. And it was billed as a retelling of Robin Hood, which I was like, okay, I'm up for that. I'm kind of curious. And I really like, Kate Stewart had another book that she wrote that was like a Christmas themed romance that I loved. I thought it was like super fun and just really enjoyed it. This is a much darker, I would refer to this as dark romance. There's kind of these like ominous undertones in the very beginning of the book. Basically there's a female main character who comes into this town where her father owns like a factory. And it's like her inheritance to like get this factory. And so he's having her like work in this factory. And through this job, she meets this guy, this man, and he like lives in a house with all of these other men and they start to have a relationship. And the book basically turns into like, some people might describe it as like a polyamorous kind of relationship where she ends up basically engaging romantically with like two men that are in this house at the same time. And it's kind of like understood that this is what they do. They like have these shared relationships. I don't know that I was expecting that from the description of like what this book was about. And there are elements of this too that I wouldn't say that it's toxic exactly, but I would say that there are elements of the romantic relationships that I'm not sure would make everyone entirely comfortable. Like there were elements as I was reading through it that I was kind of like, I'm questioning how the female main character in particular is being treated, you know, in this relationship. I'm kind of curious to see where this goes just because it was left on kind of a cliffhanger. Like there's also some like criminal activity that this group is engaging in. That's kind of like the Robin Hood component of it. And I'm like very unclear like where the plot is going. And I think there's a trilogy, if I remember correctly. So I don't know. I'm kind of like not sold yet on if I'm going to return to it or not. But if that's, again, interesting to you, I would recommend it, I guess. This is, I would say, kind of outside of what I would normally read. But I had heard good things about it, so I was willing to pick it up and kind of see what it was about. Okay, then as like a complete palate cleanser, I read The Wednesday Sisters by Meg Way Clayton. This was one of my Alphabet Challenge books for the month. This is basically a very like warm story. I mean, it has some kind of more challenging themes of like these women who meet each other at like a park where they're taking their kids, and they all join like this writing group together and basically just like live through the ups and downs of like their adulthood. And it was just very sweet. And there's a second book that's like, I think it's called The Wednesday Daughters, that like follows, you know, the families. And I feel like it was a little bit, it was well written. I mean, I can definitely say that, but it felt a little vanilla coming after some of these other books that I've read this month that were a little bit darker. And that was kind of nice to just have like a little bit of a palate cleanser as I was continuing on in my reading in the month. Okay, then I finally picked up, this has been on my list for such a long time, The Last Astronaut by David Wellington. This is a book that is basically about a retired NASA astronaut during a time period when I think NASA is basically like retired. Like it's no longer the NASA that we know it as of today. And this astronaut like thinks her career is done, and basically this like alien spaceship comes into Earth's orbit, and she gets kind of like sucked back into this particular mission of like figuring out what to do to kind of engage this alien spacecraft. I would say it is a rare thing that I will say this, but I think this would be better as a movie than a book. There's just elements of it that partially felt just very cinematic, I think, in terms of how it was written. Maybe it was intentionally written that way. But I feel like I was like imagining it more as a film than like enjoying it as a literary book. And if that sounds interesting to you, if it's like you want the fast paced and you like kind of the sci-fi thriller, this is something that I would recommend that you pick up. I feel like it was rated kind of on the lower end, closer to like 3 stars than 4 stars on like Goodreads. And I think part of it could just be that element of it. Like it doesn't read as well as a book as I think it would be experienced as a film. Okay, then I picked up a book called The Rule Book by Sarah Adams. This is the second book in her cheat sheet series. And Sarah Adams writes kind of like sports themed romances. And she was known for a long time as writing what are called like closed door romances. So things that are not super spicy. When you get to kind of like the more like romantic love scenes, it's behind closed doors. And this is a book where she's starting to kind of like shift that a little bit and have it be more open door romance. And she's acknowledged that like for her readers who are maybe more interested in the closed door, that she's kind of making that transition. I have enjoyed her books. I feel like she's not one of like the favorites that I will always pick up. But I feel like she's getting more and more interesting to me the more I read of her. Like I feel like she's getting better over time, if that makes sense. And I don't think it's just the transition from closed to open door. I think she's getting better with like character development and plot development and having more kind of intricate storylines. So this is someone that like when she has a new book out, I definitely pick it up because I feel like they're getting stronger over time. Okay, next up, I finished the Karen Pirie series by reading the 7th book in the series, which is called Past Lying by Val McDermid. This is a series that I think is ongoing, so this is probably not the final book in the series, but it is the most recent book that has come out in the series. It is about a cold case detective who is solving older crimes that are often connected to newer crimes. And I will be honest, they all kind of run together for me, so I'm going to remind myself of what this particular one was. This is one that is set during the pandemic. So I think a lot of the books we're starting to see come out now in like detective series, some of them are starting to be set in the pandemic just because it offers like a really interesting element that authors can work with. And this book is about how the cold case team, there's like this deceased crime novelist, and he's like it's called crime novelist, but he's a detective novelist. And basically he's writing these detective stories, And one of the detective stories that gets put into this like author archive in like a library after he dies is basically the story of a real story of a missing woman. And so the team gets kind of called in because they're trying to find out if he was somehow connected to this like missing woman who was missing in real life. And this one was actually really intricately plotted. It went back and forth between like reading the story that he'd written and what was going on in real life. And I actually thought this was really well done. One of the more kind of complex and complicated plots that I've seen Val McDermid do, and she can get pretty complicated in some of her other books that I've read. So this one was really fun. Okay, then I picked up a YA novel called If He Had Been With Me by Laura Nolan. This is a book that also, I believe, has a sequel it was either recently released or it's about to be released, that tells the story of this particular story from the opposite character's perspective. So there's a girl and a boy, they're teenagers, they're like neighbors, they're close friends, and she's kind of like crushing on him basically, and he has a girlfriend. And so the first book is her perspective, and I think the second book is his perspective. I will say I felt like the ending was sudden and unexpected, and I wasn't sure that I liked it. But I'm still kind of sitting with it, and especially now that I know there's a second book that has kind of this other person's perspective, I'm intrigued to see kind of where that goes. But I found this to be like pretty typical YA, and that there's just a lot of like teen angst throughout the book. So if you're looking for some teen angst, you could pick this one up. Okay, then I read pretty much back to back Rebecca Ross's duology for Elements of Cadence. The first book is called A River Enchanted, and the second book is called A Fire Endless. If you are someone who likes folklore, this would absolutely be something that I would recommend picking up. I'm not a huge folklore fan, and by folklore, I'm not referring to the Taylor Swift album. I'm referring to like the folklore tradition of writing, just to be clear. I feel like folklore is very similar to fairy tale, and I'm not really a fairy tale person either. And so this got very close to that. That said, I think it was incredibly smartly written. Rooting it in folklore of kind of the region of the world that Rebecca Ross is working within, it was very well done. So I think if this is something that's for you, you'd probably love it. And there's a lot of people who really love it. It wasn't quite for me, but I think it's because of me just not really enjoying folklore and fairy tales. Okay, then I picked up Lucy Score's first book in the Riley Thorne series called The Dead Guy Next Door. This is super fun. If you like romance / comedy / mystery, it's like a mashup, like genre mashup. I really, really enjoyed this. It is meant to be funny. There's some laugh out loud scenes. And then of course there's like the solving of this crime. And then there's just romance elements that's thrown in. I believe there's 4 books in this series right now. So this is one of 4, and it's ongoing. I think Lucy Score was just having fun. Like, you can tell that she's enjoying writing this book. And I typically know Lucy Score for just her like straight up romance, or like her dramatic suspense romance. And this I thought was just a really, really fun like romp. So highly recommend this if any of those like genre mashups sound interesting to you. Okay, then I picked up What You Never Knew by Jessica Hamilton. This was another Alphabet Challenge book for the month. And this is a book that is basically about a woman whose family owns an island, and her mother is recently deceased, and her sister is also recently deceased. And the story alternates between the woman who has inherited this island that she thought had been sold. She didn't know that they still owned it in her family, but it turns out they did, and she's now inherited it. And it alternates between her perspective and the perspective of her dead sister, who is a ghost. I thought this was really fun. There's a lot of twists and turns to it. It was just one of those books that was just kind of like lightly spooky. And it had some really interesting elements of like this woman dealing with like things she was coming to understand about her family, and like memories that were coming up for her about her childhood on this island, and challenges that she was like remembering from her parents. And then, you know, her sister has these like different things that are getting thrown in from like this ghost perspective. I just thought it was creative and fun, so I would definitely recommend that one. Okay, next up, I picked up The Witch Collector, which is the first book in the Witchwalker series by Carissa Weeks. I had seen this book recommended by one person in particular who was like very enthusiastic about this book on social media, and I followed her other stuff, and I've enjoyed her recommendations. I would say I also enjoyed this as well. It definitely has kind of like a YA bent to it a little bit, and it's basically the story of this world where there's these villages, and there's a guy that comes in, the Witch Collector, and he basically like on a regular basis, like every few years, I don't know exactly what the cycle is, he comes and like takes a witch from these villages and takes them away. And it's a little unclear like why, but the woman who's kind of the main character, who happens to be deaf, she signs, so we have this kind of element happening in the book. Her sister was taken, and so she's trying to kill the man who took her sister and or find her sister. She's not sure if her sister is alive. And then he comes back to the village, and there's kind of this like, I don't want to give too much away. I'm trying to think of how early in the book this happens. It's pretty early in the book that like basically she ends up being with the Witch Collector. Like she ends up not necessarily being taken by him, but she's like now in some kind of like alliance with him to try to travel to another location and like and you know eventually reconnect with her sister and all these different elements. And the thing that was most interesting for me was that she does have this kind of magical ability, but she does it through signs. She can't do spoken words, and typically magic is done through spoken words, and so she's found this like other way of having magic, which I think is just kind of really interesting in terms of how it's brought up in this particular storyline. I feel like this is one of those books where I might have to like read the first one again if I was going to go through the rest of the series, because there's a lot of little like intricacies and details that it's pretty, I don't want to say it's like sophisticated world building, but it's detailed world building, and that you'd want to be kind of paying attention. And I was kind of reading it more for pleasure than like really trying to understand deeply what was going on. So I could see reading this again, and I could also see going further into the series and seeing what happens. Okay, then I picked up a book called Between Shades of Grey. This is by Ruta Sepetys, and I randomly saw somebody mention this book on YouTube as something they read when they were like in college, and I had never heard of it. And it is basically about when Soviet officers during like World War II came into Lithuania and took people to concentration camps. And so this is about a 15-year-old girl who this happens, like she's taken with her family and she's trying to like be reunited with her father. This book is, I was gonna say it's relatively short, but it's almost 350 pages. It felt like a relatively, maybe it felt short to me because it's a relatively simple storyline. Like there's just these elements of the family being taken and then being in this concentration camp and trying to kind of survive and reconnect, and how they're communicating with people outside of the concentration camp and like what's happening there. And I'm trying to think if it's even, I'm looking to see if they're calling it a concentration camp or maybe just a work camp. But basically what it's trying to kind of draw attention to is how this was happening, not just to people of like Jewish origin, but there were other people who were being taken into these work camps in Russia. And I just thought it was interesting. I had never heard of this author. I'd never heard of this book. It just kind of wasn't on my radar at all. And so I was glad to pick it up and experience that. Okay, next up I picked up a book called But Everyone Feels This Way by Paige Lael. And the subtitle of this is How an Autism Diagnosis Saved My Life. So I think I've mentioned in a couple of videos now that I'm doing a side project on neurodiversity, and I'm reading several books in that area for a project I'm working on for my business. And this is a book that falls into that category. It's basically about a woman in her, I think she's in her 20s, and she's kind of describing how she came into an autism diagnosis as an adult. And there are several books out there right now that kind of fall into this category. And I appreciated this one. I mean, I think that everyone's experience is very different as they're kind of coming into diagnoses with neurodiversity. And that includes, you know, autism and ADHD and various other diagnoses that people might have. And so I've been kind of collecting these narratives, and it's been very interesting to kind of see what people's experiences are and to kind of compare them to each other. All right, the next book I picked up is called Where They Found Her by Kimberly McCreight. This is another Alphabet Challenge book, and it's told by a couple different perspectives. There's a woman who's like a reporter, and she is called to a scene where an infant is found dead. And it's by this school. And then there's a girl who goes to the school, and then there's the wife of the police chief. And there's like these different perspectives in the different chapters. I really, really like this book. I liked the perspective shifting. I liked the mystery element of it. This is more of like a literary mystery, and that it's got kind of a, I don't know, like it has a way of kind of shifting between the different character perspectives that I found to be a little bit more artistic than what I might see in other kinds of mystery novels that are a little more traditional. And I appreciated, how the author was doing that. I can't remember if I've read other books by this author, but I would definitely pick up more in the future. All right, then I picked up a book called Archer's Voice by Mia Sheridan. This is a romance novel, and it is basically about a woman who is dealing with a trauma in her life, and she moves to a small town where she encounters a man who, because of his own trauma that happened when he was a child, cannot speak. Like, he is physically unable to speak. And we've learned why, throughout this first book. There's other connected books. I think this is like a loosely connected series. There's a few books in it. And I will say that this is a book that I enjoyed. I liked the relationship. This woman who comes into this small town happens to know sign because her father was deaf. And she begins to connect with this man that a lot of other people think is like, because he's kind of mute, they think that he is also like disabled, basically like mentally disabled, and he's not. And so she kind of realizes that he is, this very intelligent, artistic, creative person, and they start to have a relationship. I'm trying to describe the elements of this book. Like, there were moments when I had to set it aside because it was almost like too sweet in terms of like the romance that's developing, despite the fact that there are some pretty dark things that are happening in each of their lives that they're kind of working through. But the way that their relationship is developing, like, for a number of reasons, and partially because of how this man was raised, he's just very innocent. And so, and she is kind of trying to help him navigate that a little bit. And so I really like where this book ends up. I would probably read other books in this loosely connected series. And there's another book that was written about a side character in this particular book that I would pick up as well, just because I think there's a side character who has like his own interesting story that I would want to follow along with. But I found that this one was a little bit, it was different than other romances I've read because of some of the elements that were being included. But the representation of kind of his disability was very interesting as well. All right, then I picked up Flawless by Elsie Silver. This is the first book in her Chestnut Spring series. I've never read Elsie Silver before, but I've heard a lot about her and a lot of really good things about her series, and I wanted to pick one up. Adding to my sub-genre of sports-themed romances, this one is about bull riding. I have not read a book, I don't think, about bull riding as a romance. And so this one was kind of fun. It's basically about a bull rider who is a little bit wild, and he gets he has like a sports agent, and the sports agent daughter, who's like a sports agent in training, is like assigned to him as basically a babysitter because he can't stay like within the rules of what he's supposed to be doing. And of course they develop a relationship. This is the first book in a multi-book series that I am actually really looking forward to diving more deeply into the series. And I just would follow this author in other series as well. So it was a good first experience with this particular author. Then I picked up Love and Other Words by Christina Lauren. Christina Lauren is an author pairing of two women who write under that name. And this is a book that, I'm just giving myself a brief reminder of the plot. There's a lot of books this month and they're all kind of running together for me. Okay. So this is the story of a woman who is engaged. She's like a resident, a doctor, and she's engaged to be married to this guy. And then like out of the blue, she runs into this other man who's like her like teenage childhood sweetheart, basically, that she knew when she was a teen. And this is like her first love kind of thing. And she runs into him, and it starts to make her question why she's with this other guy, and she's trying to like figure out, you know, if she wants to like try to be with this person from her past. I will say that maybe like 80% in, maybe a little bit later, there's a big twist, and you find out kind of, there's like a reveal that happens in this book. And I thought it was helpful to kind of understand some of the earlier parts of the book, but this book also kind of reminded me a little bit of I'm trying to remember, I think it ends with us. There's another one, I think it's like it starts with us and it ends with us. Like, I'm not sure which exactly it is. I'll put a cover into the video. But basically this other book that's about kind of the same thing, like this person who has a present day relationship, and then like this past person shows up and she begins to question things. Like, it's a little bit similar to that book. There are definitely distinct differences in terms of some of the plot, but it reminded me of that. And it was something, the second book that I'm mentioning is by Colleen Hoover. And so it was hard for me to like get that book out of my head while I was reading this book, because there were just like some really basic like plot similarities, even though there was enough differentiation that I don't think there was like a copy of one of the other, but there was some similarities there that I was kind of like referencing the other book as I was reading it. All right, then I picked up a book called Wildcat by Rebecca Genshak. This is the first book in the Wildcat Hockey series. And basically the plot of this is there is a teenage girl, or maybe like early 20s actually, girl and then a male main character, and they have like a one night stand and they hit it off, but then they don't really plan to see each other again. And then she finds out that he's a hockey player on the team that her father is the coach for. And then of course he finds out she's the coach's daughter, and they still want to have a relationship, but they're kind of like doing it a little bit secretly because of the nature of how they relate to each other. And I thought it was like, this is cute. I mean, there's a lot of hockey themed romances that I feel like they do kind of all run together a little bit. And they usually do involve something like the coach's daughter. I mean, like the tropes are, you know, they don't always stand out. But I thought for, you know, something that's within the subgenre, I thought it was well done. And I would definitely pick up another book in the series just to see what else it has in store. All right, a couple more here. Then I picked up a book called Middle of Night. This is the second book in the Jack and Jill series by Jewel Ann. And I've mentioned this series before. This is a series about adult sibling pair, a sister and a brother. And they're basically in like a witness protection program. And the first book and the second book kind of alternate between past and present as to like, how did they get to where they are now? And why are they in this kind of like situation where they're hiding, basically? And in the first book, the female main character enters into this relationship with like a neighbor in this place that they move to. And in the second book, there's like I won't say it's a cliffhanger, but like there's something that happens at the very end of the first book that continues on into the second book with this relationship. And we also start to see the brother having more of a relationship as well in this second book. There's a third book that I'll pick up, and I'm kind of curious to see where it goes. This is definitely a book that's a little bit different in terms of like the mashup of genres. I mean, it's got a little bit of mystery. It's got a little bit of romance. It's got a little bit of like family drama. And then like the going back and forth between past and present is also pretty interesting as well. All right. Then I picked up a book called, finally, I got to it, The Serpent and the Wings of Night. This is the first book in the Crowns of Nyaxia series by Carissa Broadbent. I was a little afraid to read this book because it has been hyped so much. And it's basically like a vampire romantasy novel. And I've just seen amazing things about it. And whenever I have that hype situation, I'm a little nervous to pick it up. This book totally lived up to the hype for me. It was super fun. I really enjoyed it. It's got like this obviously vampire romantasy situation. There's basically the male main character is a vampire, the female main character is a human. But there's also they're involved in this like tournament. And there's these different trials that the characters are going through. And I won't get into all the reasons why, because that could give some things away. But it's really kind of fun. And there's some like really interesting twists that happen at the end of the book that make me want to pick up like the second book pretty much immediately. I think I'm adding the second book to my June TBR list of what I want to be reading. And then I believe there's a third book that might be coming out soon in this series as well. So I would recommend this. I mean, if you're interested in romantasy that's well plotted, that has kind of that trial element to it, it was really fun. Okay, then I picked up Binding 13 by Chloe Walsh. This is the first book in the Boys of Toman series. I wasn't sure what to expect here. It is a book about a sports-themed romance. It's about rugby. I continue to add more and more sports to my sub-genre sports-themed romance reading. And this is set in a high school. And I would say, like, for the first 30 pages or so, I was like, I don't know what I think about this. The books in this series are like 600 pages long. And I thought, oh, okay, let me try this out. Let me see what I think. And the other thing I'll add about this series, there's 5 books out that are right now, that are out right now. The first book is like the first half of the story of a couple. And then the second book is the second half of the story of the couple. And then the third book is a second couple, first half. And then the fourth book is the second half of the story of that couple. So you have to read like 1,200 pages to get through like one story of one couple and like the romance that they have. Spoiler alert, I did go straight on to the second book and I like read it in very, very early June. Like as I'm recording this, I've read the second book in the series, so I will update on that at a later point. But I think that the thing that I wasn't expecting was to be completely sucked in to this story. So about 30 pages in, I was like, I don't know what I think. And then all of a sudden I was like completely sucked in, totally rooting for this couple. So basically what general plot is, there's a male main character who's a rugby player. He's kind of like a very sporty, masculine, like kind of popular, guy in this private school. And then there's this female main character who was bullied in kind of her public school. This all takes place in Ireland. And her parents take her out of her school because she's like being so traumatized by this bullying that's been going on for like years. And they move her into this private school. And she like immediately runs into this guy. And I won't explain how they meet each other, but it's kind of funny. So they meet each other and he is basically trying to resist liking her because he's like this rugby guy and he's like trying to do a sports thing and he doesn't really want to be in a relationship. And she is kind of like, well, she also kind of has feelings for him, but it's like, oh, he would never look at me. Like I'm this like she doesn't have a great perception of herself after all of this bullying. And also in her home life, there is some abuse in her family. So there's definitely a trigger warning for like domestic violence because that is happening in her storyline. And so basically, they are like fighting having a relationship, and then they eventually start to kind of like connect with each other. And this goes on for like 1,200 pages in the first 2 books, and totally sucked in the whole time. I will absolutely pick up more books in this series. Like I was just to myself, like thinking to myself this whole time, like, what is this author putting in this book that I'm like so addicted to like finding out what's going on? So highly, highly recommend. First book is called Binding 13. Second book, which I'll talk about next month, is called Keeping 13. All right, and then the final book that I read of the month, which is an alphabet challenge book, is called What Happened to Goodbye by Sarah Dessen. I had never read Sarah Dessen before, and she is kind of, I would say, like a female John Green. If you're familiar with John Green, he writes YA books that are kind of these like, a little bit of romance, like oftentimes drama, and like just teenage angst. And John Green is like the king. I mean, like he's got some really amazing books, Fault in Our Stars. The most recent one I read is Turtles All the Way Down, which was made into a film. And so this book is basically about a teenage girl who moves around a lot with her father because of his job. Her parents have recently gone through a divorce, and she's living in the most recent place, that he's moved for his work, and trying to kind of like form relationships, but not really because she knows they're going to move again. There's some drama with her mother that they're trying to kind of like work through. And then she's got some like a romantic entanglement, in this new town. And I just thought it was like a pretty strongly written, YA. I mean, I feel like it is a romance, but it's also basically about this like coming of age story of this teenage girl. I would say it's more of a coming of age story than it is like a romance. And she's just kind of like trying to figure out who she is and what that means for her relationships with her family and with her friends. And so it was well done. I mean, I would pick up another Sarah Dessen. I think if you're a John Green fan and you haven't picked up Sarah Dessen, you probably would enjoy her books as well. So those are the 32 books that I read in the month of May. A ton of really great stuff that I really, really enjoyed, and some new authors that I had not seen coming and also really, really enjoyed. If you are interested, I will have my June TBR video up soon, and you can see what I'm going to be reading in this next month. But until then, happy reading.